So, Mark. Young Mark Grummage, hey? Do you know what I love about Mark? Mark's a doer. And when we looked at coming back to Bairnsdale and starting Red Gum and leaving Sydney, I really didn't know Mark and Denise. But they said, can we help shift you? And so Mark and Denise came up with their tray truck, and we loaded about a zillion billion stuff on that shouldn't be on there, including a 10,000 litre fish pond and pianos and bird cages, and it was probably cop bait going down the road, but we shoved a lot of... But they worked for about 10 hours straight loading that truck. And I got to see Mark and Denise as people that live out what they believe. Really, really powerfully. And so, Mark, I've asked you to share something about God's grace and a verse that would mean something to you. And so what have you looked at? We can put it up on the screen if you like. It's in 2 Corinthians.
I'll put my goggles on.
Yep.
You can see my handwriting if I can hear me.
Yep.
All right. So the verse that I've got is sort of applicable to me. It's from Corinthians 12, verse 9. It says, each time he said, my grace is all you need. My power works best in weakness. So now I am glad to boast about my weakness, so that the power of Christ can work through me. So I'm trusting this morning that someone will get something, whether it's just one little sentence or one little word out of something that I say. Because right now, I'm pretty weak. I don't like coming up the front. I don't like speaking. So I'm trusting that God, through my weakness, something will happen today in your life. God will say something through me to you. It might be just one person and one word, and then that's all worth it. So I don't like being up here, and just for that reason, not just because Lex asked me, but because now I guess, like this verse, God is going to use me because I feel weak. And I know there's lots of people out sitting in their seat right now, and you don't feel like you're amounting to much. But you know, that's your bait for God, because through your weakness, God wants to use you. Now, this was Paul that was speaking this. Now, Paul, to me, strikes me as a real go-getter. When he starts something, he finishes it. Even when he was Saul, he was like a little Gestapo monster going out and dragging Christians into prison. So he's good at what he did, and I think that's why God wanted to use him. I mean, he became Paul, and he was still very good at what he did. And he even had revelations and signs from God, and God transported him into the future to see the future, which he didn't say too much about. But it'd be very easy for Paul to be proud and pumped up. So God gave him a thorn in his side to slow him down and to prick his pride. And that was a result, or why he did that was so that he could be a lot weaker than what he was. He didn't run off on his own steam, run his mouth off and look at me. So God used him in his weakness, and God could say then, it's not Paul, it's me. I'm using Paul. And that's why I reckon I can stand up here, because I'm feeling pretty weak at the moment. But Paul was glad, good at what he did, but God had to bring him down a few notches so that God could actually use him. You know, in the Israelites, in the early days in the Bible times, they weren't allowed to have horses and chariots. God said, I don't want you to have a horse and chariot. It's because they were like the nuke missiles now, and whoever's got the most of those is going to win the war. So back then, all the Egypt and all that had heaps of horses and chariots, and they were going to win the war because of the horses and chariots. They were powerful. So God said, no, you're not to use horses and chariots, because when they won the war, God wanted them to see that it was through his power not their power. That's why they won. And that's why the God wants to use weakness in us. There was a guy called, you've heard of Spurgeon. He's a great preacher many years ago. And he did a particular sermon once, and he stuttered and he spluttered, and he really struggled to get through it. And in the end, he just, between his legs, he went home and he said, Lord, just do something with that sermon. The next Sunday, he was determined to do something far better, and he spent hours preparing, and Sunday came and he did a fantastic sermon, and everyone praised him for what he did, and he had a flowery speech. But he said, I'll just look back on those two sermons. And for this first sermon that he thought was no good, he found there was 43 new converts. And on the other sermon that he did that he was all really good, there was none. So God used that sermon that he thought was weak and no good, because God did it. He didn't do it. And that's the whole crux here, is it's not us. If it's us doing it, God doesn't want to use it, because he's not going to get the glory. So he'll see someone that's no good, and he'll issue a bit of his power through them, and they'll say something or do something, and God will use them to glorify him in other people's lives. Just in slowing up a bit, Lex.
That's okay.
I think I've bumbled my way through enough yet.
You've got very good. I have a question for you, though, because you're talking about grace, and God's grace is sufficient in our weakness. Mm-hmm. Where have you personally experienced God's grace in your life?
All through my life, I suppose it's just been a slow drip, and I've been blessed that God has showed his grace through my whole life, through my wife, through my kids, some have even come here to hear me speak. Well, suckers. Anyway, but there's a few things, and particularly when I was younger, there's just, probably doesn't mean much to you guys, but it meant a lot to me. I was rotary hoeing in the back of our tractor, and I lost Dad's shifter over the back. And the rotary hoes are not these little garden ones; they're fairly big, and we could have hoed it down, a foot deep, and wouldn't know where it was. So I jumped off the tractor and I knew roughly where it was. And I said, God, can you help me find this shifter? I literally put my hand down, brushed the dirt, and there was a shifter. God's grace in that, and it meant a lot to me. And there's another instance when I probably left school, and I was timid, and I was working in this cheese factory. And I usually do the cheddar cheese, but this day I was asked to go out to do cottage cheese, and there's this grumpy old bloke out there, and if you did anything wrong, he'd just come down on you. And he said, Mark, I want you to put all these pipes and these bends and everything together. And I'd never done it before, and I didn't know how to do it, and I didn't tell him that. And he went off. I said, I don't know what I'm going to do. So I whispered a little prayer to God. God, can you help me put these pipes and these things together? And miraculously, it just happened. I don't know how it did, but I put all these bends and I hooked these things up, and I didn't get scolded by the bloke. Again, a small thing, but again, I just see as God's grace in my life, a little thing like that. Maybe just one more. Used to love motorbikes when I was younger, and we'd go riding around on this particular time. I'd come adrift. I'd hit into a bank, and the bike went flying in the air. I went over the handlebars, landed on the ground, and the bike came down, did a somersault and landed on me. And in the back mudguard, there's a fairly sufficient pipe that holds the mudguards on it. I'd bent that significantly where it had gone into my back. And I was on the ground and unconscious, with blood out my mouth, and there's three mates I was riding with, and they thought I was dead. My brother went up to Mum and Dad up the hill and said, Mark's dead. And then the other two blokes, you can imagine what Mum and Dad were thinking. But they went down to they had a house not far away, and they just prayed. And they prayed for me. They nicked off, mind you. They didn't hang around and see what I was like, but at least they went off and they prayed to God.
They just told your parents you're dead, and then they prayed. Yeah.
Well,
that's great news. You need mates like that, don't you?
Well, my brother went home and told my parents I was dead. The other two mates went back to their house and prayed for me. And I didn't think much of it at the time, and I was fine. But if you could see the impact of the bike, I could have had a broken back. I could have had anything. But afterwards I thought, the prayer of my mates may have just done something, and I'll probably never know until I asked God what happened. So again, God's grace was there looking after me. And like I said, it's just been an ongoing all the way through my life. And I think it's a result of putting God in your life. I'm nothing special, but I do believe very strongly in God. I know where I'm going after I leave here, and God honours that. I've had my ups and downs, but God's grace has always been in my life.
It's interesting because we have Reese sitting here and Milo happens to be your grandson.
Yes.
So we've got 3 generations, right? And Reese, you actually know Mark in a roundabout way as well, don't you?
Yeah.
How do you know him? As your...
My father-in-law.
Your father-in-law, yes, yeah. So,
there was another way that I didn't know about it.
No, that's what I was hoping you might say. So we're trying to just join the dots. So Mark is your father-in-law?
Yes.
And Milo's your son?
Yes.
And Tess belongs to you. She's out there somewhere. So
yes,
I don't mean she belongs. So that's just upset a few people. I said that. But what was interesting, I gave these guys about probably 6 or 7 different verses in the New Testament on grace to choose, and they both started fighting over that same verse. But because Mark got in first, he grabbed it, right? So possession. But would you like to comment on that verse as well? Because you sort of wanted to speak on that originally, didn't you?
This is maybe more in general, but I don't profess to be like a authority on grace or necessarily anything, God bar the experiences that I've had and what I know based on the Bible. One thing for me that I'm still growing personally is I guess it kind of relates to this grace, is my more heart connection with God as opposed to my head connection, because I feel like I have a reasonably good head knowledge of the Bible, but sometimes that head knowledge doesn't always translate to a heart knowledge. And that's actually where this grace side of things, I guess, comes in terms of my just brief looking through the verses that we kind of were given there. So
you've chosen Hebrews 4 verse 16, haven't you?
Yes.
So can we get that up on the screen? You want to talk a little bit about that? Mark, we're not finished with you yet, so just stay there. Yep. No.
So the verse I chose here was 4:16. So
why did you choose that?
It was one of the 6.
Yes. And Mark stole the other one. There's nothing left. Yeah, I know.
Yeah. So
the scraping the barrel.
Yeah. No, I liked the sound of it. Just reading it, it gave me a bit of peace, I guess. And as it's talking about approaching God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy, because as kind of like Mark was expressing before, and like I guess all of us do, like I need a lot of mercy. This year's been a very challenging year professionally for me, and I've needed a lot of grace and a lot of mercy throughout this year, so I've kind of experienced that as we went. But one thing I tend to do, I guess, one thing I did when you asked me about doing this, is I went and found out those that I respected in terms of their spiritual knowledge and saw what they had to say. So I just listened to a little podcast by Timothy Keller, which was literally called The Grace of God. And he expresses the understanding of grace is that if it doesn't considerably change your life and impact the way you behave on a daily basis, then you don't understand grace, which is actually a really confronting thing to hear, because we talk about grace all the time, and you say grace before you eat dinner, and there's a whole bunch of different things, but it does kind of get lost in the day-to-day, and it's not until you begin to sit down and actually meditate on it that you do realise the power and how it should change us. And it's So I listened to that. I was watching it, and I'm going to have to listen to it a few times to really let it sink in, I guess. But I'm going
to keep you on that thought, right?
Yeah.
Because growing up, you hear definitions, and the word grace is one of those fuzzy words that we throw around, and we sort of know what it means, and we sort of know it's important, but we're not quite sure why sometimes. And you'll hear a definition that grace is the undeserved favour, the undeserved merit of God, right? And in the Old Covenant, in the Old Testament, the word grace and the word favour, or the favour of God, the grace of God, are almost interchangeable. But in the New Testament, it's actually different. And what Timothy Callis was saying, what resonated with you, if you actually look up the Greek word that's translated grace throughout the New Testament, its literal meaning is the divine influence on the human heart that's then reflected in our life. So it's God's impact on our life that's then reflected out of our life. And that's what you're saying, that if there hasn't been this change, then you haven't experienced grace. Because so you can take on theology and believe stuff, but it doesn't change you. You could argue. You're talking about head knowledge and heart, right? So that's a challenge to you because it's about heart, isn't it?
Yeah, well, and that's where I sit currently, is that, to be fair, maybe grace, my understanding of grace hasn't changed me as much as it should have, if I really can appreciate it and take it on.
Or would like to have.
Or would like to have, yes.
I hate the word should, ought to, need to, must to, because they're condemning words. But imagine if God's grace really changed us, how God wants that to happen, how that would flow over into our lives in very powerful ways.
Yeah. And so he goes into the two areas which kind of, I guess, help you to appreciate the magnitude of grace in our lives and how it should actually do that. And he talks about being indispensable. As if you don't see it as being indispensable, then it's not grace in its, I guess, truest form. It's just a nice gift which anyone can give. But the grace of God is obviously way different to that. And then he talks about its cost as well. If you don't fully appreciate the cost of the gift, then it doesn't also have the same power. And so as far as the cost goes, Timothy talks about how because of the cost, and we talk obviously about Jesus' death and resurrection, and he took on our sin. But again, it's not until you actually really get into what that really actually meant that his cost allowed God to see us in the same way that he sees Jesus. I know we kind of hear that all the time, and maybe I'm repeating what we already know, but as Grace says, we don't deserve any of this, but he gave it to us so that we were raised in Christ, and we're seen in exactly the same way as Christ does because of what he did. And then obviously he took on everything that we should have, not just physically in terms of our physical punishment that he took on the cross, but also spiritually in terms of his spiritual separation from God that we should have actually taken. And usually if you see something like that in the world, there's a give and a take. Yep. Even if gift's free, there's generally something that goes along with it.
Somewhere.
Yeah. And it might not be necessarily that you have to do it, but it also could be in someone's self-righteousness of that gift. Like there's a pride in the giving of the gift as well.
So just take us back. You're saying, because you work as a teacher,
yes,
at the Christian school,
yes,
and you're saying the challenges that you personally have felt. How have you experienced God's grace personally through those challenges?
I guess, again, being vulnerable up here in terms of taking on a role which you feel incapable of doing. I did it in terms of it was more of a mindset thing as opposed to necessarily a spiritual thing, but it turned out to be both anyway. But I wanted to take on the mindset of a lot of the things we teach our students is to take risks, is to is to not be afraid to try something new, and you talk about that all the time with kids, but as a teacher you need to also model what you expect of those around you, because we tend to set the tone for the classroom. And so I decided to take on a role that I didn't feel necessarily capable to do.
So is this teaching a different, instead of physical education stuff that you're good at, doing something different, teaching another subject?
Yes. I ended up taking on 3 subjects that I never taught before, as well as then also leading a team of teachers too, which I haven't done before. But I've had to rely on God, because there's a number of times throughout these years that plenty, or it's almost a daily basis, that I just don't feel competent or capable, yet there's continually grace and blessing that flows from it, because God just uses it anyway, even though I feel like it's a complete failure, or I feel like a term's just kind of been lost. It ends up that there's part of that term that's just been reflected in this success, which wasn't anything I intended to do, but God ended up using it anyway. And that's what I kind of liked about Mark's verse as well, is that he used it in the weakness so that we can't boast. Because a lot of the time in our society, people will be generous, and I guess that's the difference as well between being good and being a follower of God, is that you don't boast in your goodness, because without him you'd be dead because of your sin. Yeah. So, and then I guess for me there's another one as well, is I physically wouldn't be here without the grace of God. So in terms of a unmerited gift, I drowned surfing. And so
this is wonderful, isn't it? We've got 2 dead people up this morning talking to us. Like, seriously, I want some live people. So you died on a motorbike and you drowned.
Yeah.
Can we get some live people in this room to come and... You look fairly alive.
Well, yeah. Not because of anything I did. I was passed out and I had a seizure when I was out surfing, and so fell off my board and drowned. And it was only because there was what has been described as an angel on the beach that I am now here. So it's not a super long story, but essentially there was a couple of guys on the beach. One of the fishermen that was there watching us, he was obviously fishing, and then another surfer was just sitting on the dunes. This is down in Gunnamatta in the peninsula, which is known for...
I've been skin diving around Gunnamatta.
Yeah, it's known for taking...
A lot of undertows there.
Yes,
there is.
A lot of undertows. So I was out surfing and had a seizure as I was coming back in, and went under the water, and the fisherman and the surfer both saw me and came out and got me. And thankfully, when I came in, I didn't need CPR. The surfer put me in a position which
they just didn't want to kiss a guy.
Well,
no.
So he put me in the position and did a few things apparently that saved my life as far as the paramedics were concerned. But then when they looked for him after, they couldn't find him. And this was a spot on the far left side of the beach, which is very 2 k's from the car park. There's nothing over the dunes, there's nothing around. And they said at the start when they came in to surf, they thought it was weird that he was sitting here, because they said it was a perfect day, like the waves were awesome, you would be straight out there, you wouldn't be watching. So he came and saved me and then disappeared. So,
well, we're very thankful that you both are alive. Yep. I'm always fascinated by people's stories. Like, every one of you sitting here, everyone watching online has a story. We all have a story. There's this intersection with God's grace in our life if we allow him. You know, it's a very, very powerful thing. Has anyone got any questions for these guys?
Right.
So you're all sitting there so relaxed, and then I suddenly go, has anyone got a question? You go, has anyone got a question? Yep, Tony.
Who gave them the grace?
Who gave them the grace? Yeah.
Who did they think?
So where does God's grace come from, do you mean? Or is the grace that we're talking about, where does that come from?
Where did it come from?
Yeah. Mark?
Well, I think as we've been talking, it's God's free, undeserved favour. It comes from God. And for those that believe in Him, I guess if you don't believe in God, He's not going to give you something you don't believe in. But I believe in God wholeheartedly, and I don't deserve it, but He gives me favour from time to time, and particularly in my weakness. He just loves to show His power in people's weakness. But yeah, it comes from God. I don't know.
Reece, you got anything to add
Scholar
there?
over here, you got anything to say on that?
Yeah, I guess I'd agree with Mark on that. And then I guess the area that I find challenging is that, is that He gives it to you not expecting anything in return. And that's just not in a nice way, but absolutely nothing. He doesn't expect you to be perfect. He doesn't expect you to be a certain type of Christian. But He gives it to you anyway, and He did this before you knew Him. And not only did He give it to you, but He also exposed it to you as well, because we didn't search for Him. He found us, and He approached us first. And so that's where it's actually I find it really challenging as far as I don't know what you want to call it, a concept or a relationship, but you feel like you need to do something to be able to pay it back, or to be able to make it feel like you deserve His love, kind of thing. But He's like, I don't care. It's not about that. It's just about, I did it regardless. I didn't do it because I wanted anything from you. I just did it because you're you and you're worth it before anything else. And is just so challenging on a day-to-day, to not let your own self-righteousness, your pride in how good you are, or your want to be for approval to get in the way of actually grace impacting your life, and then allowing that to just take over.
It's interesting. We're through this subject of grace, and we talked a little bit last week about law and grace and the difference. We put it in the middle of this Village Life series, and we talked about earlier the need to be able to easily forgive and to continually keep forgiving one another, because you'll disappoint me and I'll disappoint you. But how do you forgive without God's grace in your life? That's a question, Mark. How do we, in a marriage, in our personal relationships, how do we keep giving without grace?
I guess it's, for me, God's watching every move and everything I do. If I have a fight with my wife, I need to...
You lose.
Yes, that too.
Yes. Graciously.
No, I just think because of God in my life and He's watching me, if He wasn't there watching me, you'd go and do whatever you liked and you'd think you'd get away with it, but you can't get away with anything because God's there. So you have a fight, you ask for forgiveness and you move on.
What's the role of grace when it comes to forgiveness?
Well, God, I suppose, for me, as a husband, it's just knowing God. Hang on, I just fell it down. It's knowing that God will forgive me through His grace, so I've got to pass that on to others. As His is the ultimate example, I suppose, in my life.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Fantastic. Any last little thoughts you had there, Reece, that you wanted to add in?
Don't talk for too long. You're making me look real bad.
Hey, Mark, it's not all about you. You're attention-seeking, Mark.
Oh, thanks, Lex. Yeah, sure.
I guess the other thing that Timothy Keller again mentioned was that when we truly understand God's grace and the indispensable nature of it and the costly nature of it, there's no other response than joy. Yep. Because there's nothing you've done to deserve any of it. So gratitude and joy is essentially your only response, because you can't take pride in any of it. And so, I guess that's kind of why that approaching with confidence, what was it? The throne of grace with confidence. And I added in joy, confidence and joy.
Well, I want to come back to that, because this is the actual definition of grace, that wherever you see this word in the New Testament, it literally means, only people that need glasses are smiling at the moment because you understand the thing. It talks about the divine influence upon the heart and its reflection in the life, including gratitude, benefit, favour, gift, gracious joy, liberality, which is generosity, pleasure, and this sense of thankfulness, this thanksworthy, they use this word. But grace creates this joy in us, a thankfulness. You can see God reflecting His grace reflecting back out of you. So I thank you both. The reason that I asked you both to come was because that I know you don't like talking, Mark, but you actually have something to say.
Was it about enough job? You won't ask me again, Lex.
No. I appreciate and I appreciate your integrity of how you live, right? And we just want to finish with it was interesting. Charlie's crook this morning, but he was going to do this as an item, this song. And I came in and said to Amy this morning, Charlie's got bronchitis, and hi Charlie. And I said, so Charlie can't do the song. And Amy says, oh, it's okay, I'll do it. And I thought, how fantastic that it's not about perfection. It's not, she hadn't had a practice of it, it's just, I'll serve, I'll do whatever I can. And that's God's grace in action, isn't it? So they're just trying to work out what key or something or other. But thank you.
Unlock the iPad.
Unlock the iPad, okay.